Emily Richardson stood in the marble lobby of Whitmore and Associates with rain still dripping from her coat, the kind of cold October rain that Boston sends through your bones, and in her hand was an envelope she had been summoned to collect 3 days after her father's funeral, an envelope that felt too light to contain any form of mercy. The senior partner had looked at her with something like pity when he'd called, his voice careful and distant over the phone, and she had known, somehow, even before stepping into that towering office building overlooking the financial district, that her father's final act would be rejection. Richard Richardson, the self-made commercial real estate titan who'd built an empire from nothing, had cut his only daughter from his will entirely, leaving his $73 million estate to a network of charities she'd never heard him mention. And as Emma stood there watching rain streak down glass walls 40 stories above the city, she felt the floor drop away beneath her, unaware that the truth waiting in that envelope would shatter everything she believed about love, sacrifice, and the last 5 years of silence between them. The office smelled like leather and old money, that particular scent of polished wood and expensive cologne that Emily had learned to associate with her father's world, a world she had never quite belonged to, no matter how many childhood dinners she'd sat through in silence while he discussed acquisitions and market trends with men who looked through her like glass. She took the seat the paralegal offered, a burgundy chair that probably cost more than her monthly rent, and watched as Martin Whitmore, 70 years old with silver hair and a face carved from granite and discretion, settled behind his desk with the slow deliberation of a man who had delivered bad news to families for 4 decades. The envelope sat between them, cream-colored and official, her name written across it in her father's angular handwriting, and she found herself unable to reach for it, unable to make her fingers close around the last words her father would ever speak to her. Outside, Boston moved through its late afternoon rhythm, cars honking on Congress Street, professionals hurrying through rain toward the T station, the city indifferent to the small devastations happening in offices like this one. And Emily thought about the last time she had seen her father alive, 18 months ago, at a charity gala she'd attended only because her stepmother Vanessa had insisted, demanded really, that Emily show her face, play the role of devoted daughter for the photographers and donors who expected Richard Richardson's family to look complete and functional. He had barely looked at her that night, had offered only the briefest nod of acknowledgement before turning back to a conversation about waterfront development. And she had stood there in a dress she couldn't afford, bought specifically for that event, feeling like a ghost in her own father's life. That was when she'd stopped trying, stopped calling, stopped hoping that somewhere beneath the empire and the ambition was the man who used to read her bedtime stories, who used to call her his little architect when she built towers from blocks on his office floor. Martin cleared his throat, pulling her back to the present, to this room where her worst fears were about to be confirmed. He explained the situation with the careful neutrality of a man trained never to reveal his own opinions, told her that her father had revised his will 8 months before his death, that the estate had been valued at $73.2 million, that every asset, every property, every investment account had been designated for distribution to a list of charitable organizations focused on education, housing development, and medical research. Emily listened to the words, but they seemed to come from very far away, filtered through water or distance, and she found herself studying the rain instead, the way it caught light as it fell past the window, turning the city below into something blurred and uncertain. She had expected this, had known it was coming, had told herself for 3 days that it didn't matter, that she had built a life without his money, without his approval, that she was fine teaching 3rd graders in Somerville and living in a 1-bedroom apartment with radiators that clanked through winter nights, but expecting pain and experiencing it turned out to be entirely different things. And if stories like this speak to you in any way, make sure to subscribe now, because every narrative here hides a truth no one sees coming, and I want you with me for every revelation. Martin slid the envelope across the desk, his fingers leaving it just within her reach, and told her that her father had left a personal letter, separate from the will itself, something he'd insisted be delivered to her directly. And Emily felt her throat tighten, because she couldn't imagine what words could possibly soften this, what explanation could make sense of being erased from your own father's legacy. She picked up the envelope with hands that trembled slightly, hating herself for the trembling, for caring this much about a man who had clearly stopped caring about her years ago. And she thought about her student loans, $60,000 of debt from the education her father had refused to help with after she'd chosen teaching over business school, about the medical bills from last year's emergency appendectomy that she was still paying off in installments, about the future she'd imagined where maybe, somehow, there would be enough breathing room to stop drowning in the shallow end of American capitalism. Martin was saying something about the executor's timeline, about asset distribution and tax implications, but Emily wasn't listening anymore because she had opened the envelope, and inside was not a letter, but a single sentence on her father's personal stationery, written in that same angular hand that had signed her birthday cards when she was small, back when he still remembered her birthday. "I'm sorry for what I had to do, but you'll understand when the time is right." And that was all. 11 words that explained nothing, that offered no comfort and no clarity, just another riddle from a man who had always spoken in abstractions and strategies, who had treated life like a chess game where every move served some larger purpose only he could see. She read it 3 times, searching for hidden meaning, for some indication of love or regret or acknowledgement that she had existed, that she had mattered, but there was nothing, just ink on paper and the faint impression of his pen pressed hard at the period, as if he'd been angry or determined or simply ready to be finished. She thanked Martin Whitmore for his time, her voice steady despite everything, and she walked out of that office building into rain that had turned heavier, colder, the kind of November storm that feels personal. And she stood on the corner of Congress and State Street, letting water soak through her jacket, while taxis sprayed dirty puddle water across the crosswalk and strangers rushed past with umbrellas and purpose. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, probably Vanessa calling to discuss funeral arrangements or estate details, and Emily ignored it because she couldn't bear to hear her stepmother's carefully modulated sympathy, the performance of grief from a woman who had never particularly wanted a stepdaughter, who had always treated Emily like an obligation Richard had failed to properly manage. She walked through the financial district toward the harbor, past the old Custom House Tower and the tourist restaurants near Faneuil Hall, walked until her feet ached and her clothes were soaked through, and the city lights began reflecting off wet pavement in colors that looked almost beautiful if you didn't think too hard about what they represented. By the time she reached the harbor, night had settled over the water, and she stood at the edge of Long Wharf, watching boats bob in their slips, their running lights swaying with the tide. And she tried to remember when exactly her father had stopped seeing her, when she had transformed from daughter into disappointment. Maybe it was when her mother died 14 years ago, cancer that ate through her in 6 months, leaving Richard hollow and furious, and eventually remarried to Vanessa within 18 months, a timeline that had felt like betrayal then and still felt like betrayal now. Maybe it was when Emily chose education over economics, chose purpose over profit, chose a life that meant something to her even if it meant nothing to him. Or maybe, and this was the thought that hurt most, maybe he had never really seen her at all. Maybe she had always been a supporting character in his story, easily written out when the plot demanded it. She pulled out her phone and looked at Vanessa's messages, 3 of them, each more insistent than the last, asking Emily to come to the house in Beacon Hill, saying there were family matters to discuss, estate details that required her attention. Emily almost deleted them, almost walked away from the whole thing, but something in that last cryptic sentence from her father kept circling back. "You'll understand when the time is right." and she wondered what exactly she was supposed to understand, what truth he thought would eventually reveal itself, what time he'd been waiting for that had apparently run out before he could explain himself. So she did what daughters do even when they know better, even when they've been hurt beyond reason. She turned back toward the tea station and began the journey to Beacon Hill, to the house where she'd grown up and been slowly erased, unaware that the truth waiting there would rewrite everything she thought she knew about her father's silence, about love and protection, about the terrible choices people make when they're trying to save the ones they cannot bear to lose. The Richardson house rose from Beacon Hill like something out of a period film, all red brick and black shutters and windows that glowed amber against the November dark, the kind of historic townhouse that had been standing since before the Civil War and would likely stand long after everyone currently living inside it had turned to dust. Emily climbed the familiar stone steps, worn smooth by generations of feet, and used the key she'd never returned, the one her father had given her when she turned 16, back when this had still been home rather than mausoleum. The door opened into the foyer, with its black and white marble floor, its crystal chandelier that had cost more than most people's cars, and she could hear voices coming from the drawing room, Vanessa's carefully modulated tone, and someone else, a man's voice she didn't immediately recognize. She found them arranged like a tableau in the room her father had used for entertaining important guests. Vanessa on the ivory sofa, in a black dress that probably cost what Emily made in a month, her blonde hair swept into a chignon that belonged in a different century. And beside her sat a man in his 50s, expensive suit, leather briefcase at his feet, the kind of legal predator who specialized in estate law and family disputes. Vanessa looked up when Emily entered, her expression shifting through several calculations before settling on something approximating warmth, and she gestured for Emily to sit in the chair opposite, the positioning already suggesting sides, already framing this as negotiation rather than family. The man introduced himself as Douglas Pembroke, Vanessa's personal attorney, and Emily felt something cold settle in her chest, because you didn't bring your personal attorney to a family discussion unless you were preparing for war. Vanessa explained, her voice honey over steel, that she had concerns about the will, that while she respected Richard's charitable impulses, she felt certain arrangements had been made under duress, that her husband's final months had been characterized by pain medication and declining mental clarity, and that she intended to contest the distribution on grounds of diminished capacity. She said this as if it were reasonable, as if she were simply protecting her late husband's true wishes. But Emily could see the calculation behind her stepmother's carefully made-up eyes, could see the woman who had married wealth and had no intention of watching it slip away to organizations that couldn't fight back. Douglas Pembroke added legal weight to the argument, cited precedents and timelines, explained that Massachusetts law provided clear grounds for challenging testamentary documents when cognitive impairment could be demonstrated, and Emily sat there feeling like she'd stumbled into someone else's nightmare, into a version of grief that had nothing to do with loss and everything to do with money. But what struck Emily as strange, what made her lean forward slightly in that expensive chair, was that Vanessa seemed nervous, seemed to be watching Emily too carefully, as if waiting for some specific reaction, some sign that Emily understood something she wasn't supposed to understand yet. The way Vanessa's fingers kept returning to her pearl necklace, worrying at it like a rosary, the way she glanced at Douglas every time she finished a sentence, seeking confirmation or permission, these were not the behaviors of a woman confident in her position. These were the movements of someone afraid, someone scrambling to control a situation that was already slipping sideways, and Emily found herself wondering what exactly Vanessa was afraid of, what piece of this puzzle she was missing. Douglas was explaining the timeline for filing the contest, something about 60-day windows and probate court procedures, when Emily interrupted with a question that surprised even herself. She asked why Vanessa was telling her this, why she needed Emily to know about the legal challenges challenge, since Emily had nothing to gain or lose from charitable distributions being overturned. The room went quiet in a way that felt heavy, significant, and Vanessa exchanged a look with Douglas that confirmed Emily's instinct that something else was happening here, something beneath the surface of estate law and widows' rights. Vanessa said, choosing her words carefully, that she wanted Emily to understand the situation, that families should be united in these matters, that perhaps if Emily supported the contest, testified about her father's declining health in his final months, it would strengthen their position considerably. And there it was, the real reason for this meeting, the actual strategy emerging from beneath polite language and legal terminology. Vanessa wanted Emily to help dismantle her father's final wishes, wanted her to stand in court and declare him incompetent, wanted to use the daughter he'd rejected as a weapon against the legacy he'd tried to build. Emily felt something like nausea rise in her throat because despite everything, despite being cut from the will and ignored for years, the idea of publicly declaring her father mentally unfit felt like a betrayal she couldn't stomach, felt like desecrating whatever small dignity his death might have carried. She said no, said it quietly but firmly, said she wouldn't be part of this, and she watched Vanessa's expression shift from persuasive to calculating to something harder, something that looked almost like threat. Vanessa leaned forward, her voice dropping into a register that suggested intimacy but felt more like invasion, and she told Emily that she knew about the debts, knew about the student loans and medical bills, knew that Emily was barely surviving on a teacher's salary in one of the most expensive cities in America. She suggested that if Emily cooperated, if she helped contest the will successfully, Vanessa would be willing to share a portion of the recovered estate, enough to clear Emily's debts and provide some cushion for the future. It was bribery dressed up as generosity, manipulation presented as family, looking out for family. And Emily understood in that moment that Vanessa had researched her stepdaughter's vulnerabilities with the same cold precision her father had once used to identify failing companies ripe for acquisition. Emily stood up, her chair scraping against hardwood that had been in this house for 150 years, and she told Vanessa and her lawyer that they could do whatever they needed to do, but they would do it without her testimony, without her participation, without using her to rewrite her father's final choices. She turned toward the door, ready to leave this house and never return, when Vanessa said something that stopped her mid-step. Something that changed the temperature of the entire room. Vanessa said that Emily should be careful, that there were things about Richard's business dealings Emily didn't understand, things that might come to light during a legal challenge, things that might change how she remembered her father entirely. It was a warning and a threat simultaneously, wrapped in concern but delivering menace, and Emily turned back to find her stepmother watching her with eyes that held something like triumph, as if she'd already won a game Emily hadn't known they were playing. Emily asked what Vanessa meant, what secrets she thought she was protecting, but her stepmother just smiled, a thin, precise expression that didn't reach her eyes, and said that some truths were better left buried, that Emily should think very carefully about whether she wanted to start digging into her father's past, into the real sources of his wealth, into decisions he'd made that might tarnish the memory Emily still carried. It was manipulation of the cruelest kind, using mystery as leverage, suggesting darkness without providing evidence, and Emily felt anger finally cutting through the grief and confusion that had paralyzed her since that envelope had landed in her hands 3 days ago. She left without another word, walked out into November cold that felt cleaner than the air inside that house, and she stood on the brick sidewalk of Beacon Hill with historic gas lamps casting pools of light along Mount Vernon Street, and she tried to understand what had just happened, what game Vanessa was actually playing. The threat had been clear: cooperate or face revelation, help contest the will or watch your father's reputation destroyed. But what Emily couldn't figure out was why Vanessa thought any of it would matter to her, why the promise of scandal would somehow convince her to betray her father's final wishes. Unless Vanessa didn't actually know Emily at all, didn't understand that Emily had already lost her father years before his death, that there was no relationship left to protect, no illusion of family harmony worth preserving through lies. She walked down the hill toward Charles Street, past the boutiques and restaurants that catered to old money and new tourists, and she pulled out her phone to look again at that cryptic sentence her father had left her. "I'm sorry for what I had to do, but you'll understand when the time is right." The words felt different now, heavier with implication, and she wondered if her father had known Vanessa would do this, if he'd anticipated the legal challenge and left that message as some kind of breadcrumb, some indication that the truth was more complicated than it appeared. Or maybe she was just desperate to find meaning where there was none, desperate to believe that somewhere in the wreckage of their relationship was evidence that he'd loved her after all. Her phone rang, Martin Whitmore's office, and she answered, expecting some administrative detail about the estate, but instead it was Martin himself, his voice lower than it had been that afternoon, more urgent. He told her that something had come to his attention after their meeting, something irregular about the will's filing, and he asked if she could come back to his office tomorrow morning, earlier than normal business hours, before other partners arrived. He couldn't explain over the phone, he said, but it was important, possibly very important, and Emily agreed because she had nowhere else to turn, no other thread to follow in this maze her father had left behind. She took the T home to Somerville, squeezed into a Green Line car with college students and late-shift workers, and she watched the city slide past dirty windows while strangers' conversations washed over her in waves of noise and distraction. Her apartment felt smaller when she finally reached it, the radiator clanking its evening song, her stack of ungraded papers waiting on the kitchen table where she'd left them that morning before the funeral, before the will reading, before the world had shifted sideways. She made tea she didn't drink and sat by her window watching rain start again, and she thought about her father in that big house on Beacon Hill, dying alone, except for a wife who was already planning to dismantle his legacy. And she wondered if he'd known, if he'd felt the walls closing in, if that last cryptic message had been his way of fighting back from beyond the grave. Sleep didn't come easily that night, and when it did, it brought dreams of her father's office, the way it had looked when she was small, before the empire grew too large for sentiment, before business consumed everything else. She dreamed of sitting on his lap while he worked, of building block towers on his floor while he made phone calls, of the way he used to say her name like it meant something, like she was someone worth knowing. And she woke up at 3 in the morning with tears on her face and a certainty settling in her chest that whatever Vanessa was hiding, whatever truth her father had been protecting, she was going to find it, was going to dig until the whole story came to light, because the man who'd raised her, before grief and ambition had hardened him into someone else, deserved at least that much, deserved to have his final choices understood rather than simply judged and dismantled by a woman who'd never really known him at all. Martin Whitmore's office looked different at 7 in the morning, the early light cutting through floor-to-ceiling windows in sharp angles that made the expensive furniture cast long shadows across Persian rugs, and Emily arrived to find him already there, coffee going cold on his desk. Files spread across the surface in a pattern that suggested he'd been working through the night. He stood when she entered, gestured for her to close the door behind her, and there was something in his careful lawyer's face that had cracked slightly, some professional veneer stripped away to reveal genuine concern beneath. And Emily knew before he spoke that whatever he'd discovered was going to complicate everything she thought she understood about her father's death. He told her to sit, and she did, taking the same burgundy chair from yesterday while Martin paced to the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that reminded her suddenly of her father, the way Richard used to stand when he was working through difficult decisions, weighing options and consequences with the cold calculation of a man who'd built an empire empire by never letting emotion cloud judgment. Martin explained that after Emily had left yesterday, he'd been reviewing the estate files more carefully, cross-referencing dates and signatures and notarizations, standard due diligence he performed on all testamentary documents, and he'd found something that troubled him deeply, something that called into question the entire probate process they'd initiated. The will that had been filed, the one leaving everything to charity, had been properly executed and witnessed. But Martin had discovered a notation in Richard's personal files, a reference to a second document, something his father had called the insurance policy, dated 3 weeks after the charitable will had been signed. Emily leaned forward, her hands gripping the armrests of that expensive chair, and she asked what the notation meant, what kind of insurance policy her father could have been referring to, and Martin turned from the window with an expression that mixed professional caution with something darker, something that looked like suspicion or maybe fear. He said he didn't know, that the reference was cryptic and provided no details about location or contents, but that Richard Richardson hadn't been the kind of man who used language carelessly, hadn't been the type to reference an insurance policy without meaning something specific, something legally significant. Martin had spent the night searching through his firm's records, through every file and correspondence and memo related to Richard's estate planning, and he'd found nothing, no second will, no codicil, no trust document that might explain the notation, which meant either the insurance policy didn't exist, or it had been deliberately kept outside normal legal channels, hidden somewhere only Richard knew about. The implication hung between them like smoke, heavy and choking, and Emily felt her mind racing through possibilities, through scenarios that all seemed to point toward the same conclusion. Her father had anticipated something, had prepared for some contingency, had created a backup plan that he'd kept secret even from his primary attorney. Martin said he was obligated to report the notation to the probate court, that withholding potential evidence of alternative testamentary intent could cost him his license and possibly result in criminal charges. But before he filed anything official, he wanted to give Emily a chance to search her father's personal effects, to see if she could locate whatever document Richard had been referring to, because if there was a second will, if there was something that contradicted the charitable distribution, it would change everything about the estate settlement and possibly about Vanessa's legal position. Emily asked why Martin was telling her this instead of Vanessa, why he was trusting her with information that could affect the entire estate, and the old lawyer's expression softened into something almost paternal, almost kind. He said that in the 40 years he'd known Richard Richardson, he'd watched the man transform from ambitious young developer into something harder, colder, especially after Emily's mother had died, but that Richard had always spoken about his daughter with a particular quality in his voice, a softness that never appeared when he discussed business or property or even his second wife. Martin said he'd been present at enough will signings to know when a client was at peace with their decisions and when they were executing documents with the grim determination of someone following a strategy they didn't particularly like, and that when Richard had signed the charitable will 8 months ago, he'd looked like a man doing something necessary rather than something desired, like a man playing chess and sacrificing his queen to protect his king. The metaphor landed hard in Emily's chest, and she thought about that cryptic note her father had left, about understanding when the time was right, and she wondered if the time Martin was describing was now, if this discovery of the insurance policy notation was the trigger her father had been waiting for, the moment when truth could finally surface without causing whatever damage he'd been trying to prevent. She asked Martin what kind of places her father might hide important documents, where a man like Richard Richardson would stash something he wanted protected but eventually found, and Martin considered the question with the seriousness of someone who'd spent decades studying human nature through the lens of estate planning. He said that in his experience, people hid their most important secrets in places that held emotional significance, places that meant something only to the people they wanted to eventually discover them, locations that would seem obvious in retrospect but remained invisible to anyone who didn't understand the underlying symbolism. Emily left Martin's office with a sense of purpose that felt almost dangerous, almost reckless, and she took the tea back to Beacon Hill even though it was still early morning, even though she knew Vanessa would be home, because she couldn't wait, couldn't let another day pass while some crucial piece of her father's truth remained hidden in that house where he died. She used her key again, let herself into the foyer that smelled like furniture polish and Vanessa's expensive perfume, and she climbed the curved staircase to the third floor, where her father's private study remained exactly as he'd left it, untouched by Vanessa's redecorating impulses, a room that still held the particular atmosphere of Richard Richardson's presence, tobacco and leather, and the faint chemical smell of the blueprint paper he'd used before everything went digital. The study looked like a museum exhibit dedicated to a particular kind of masculine success. All dark wood and glass-fronted bookcases, framed photographs of buildings her father had developed, scattered across walls painted deep green, and his desk sat before the window overlooking the brick-lined street below, the same desk where he'd worked late into countless nights while Emily's mother was dying downstairs, the same desk where he'd sat when Emily had told him she was choosing education over business school, and he'd looked at her with something that might have been disappointment, or might have been something else entirely, something she'd been too young and hurt to properly interpret. She stood in the doorway, remembering how this room had once felt magical, back when she was small enough to think her father was a kind of magician, someone who could transform empty lots into buildings that touched the sky. And she felt the weight of all those lost years pressing down on her shoulders, all the conversations they'd never had, all the explanations that had died with him. She started with the obvious places, the desk drawers where her father had kept contracts and correspondence, the filing cabinets that held decades of business records, organized with obsessive precision, and she searched through folders labeled with project names and property addresses, through tax documents and partnership agreements and purchase orders, but she found nothing that looked like a will, nothing that suggested insurance policy or backup plan or hidden truth. She moved to the bookcases, pulling volumes from shelves, shaking them to see if anything fell out, checking behind the rows for hidden compartments or safes. And she thought about Martin's advice, about emotional significance and symbolic locations, about where her father might hide something meant specifically for her to find. That's when she remembered the model, the architectural model her father had kept on the credenza behind his desk, a scale replica of the first building he'd ever developed, a 6-story apartment complex in Dorchester that had launched his career and his fortune. Emily had loved that model when she was small, had spent hours studying its tiny windows and detailed brickwork, had imagined miniature families living inside those miniature rooms, and her father had let her play with it despite its obvious value, had let her rearrange the tiny cars in the parking lot and create stories about the people who might live there. She picked it up now, this relic of her childhood and her father's early ambition, and she turned it over in her hands, and that's when she felt it, a slight looseness in the base, a seam that shouldn't have been there. The bottom panel came away easily once she found the hidden latches, and inside the hollow base was a manila envelope, unsealed, her name written across it in her father's handwriting, and Emily's hands were shaking as she pulled out the contents, as she unfolded pages that had been waiting in darkness for months, waiting for this exact moment, for her to be desperate enough, or curious enough, or brave enough to keep searching when everything else pointed toward giving up. It was a will, a complete last will and testament, dated 2 weeks after the charitable version Martin had filed, and the first paragraph made Emily's breath catch in her throat because it revoked all previous wills and codicils and left the entirety of Richard Richardson's estate to his daughter Emily Richardson, unconditionally, immediately, with no restrictions and no charitable distributions, just a father's fortune passing to his only child the way inheritance had passed for generations. But it was the letter attached to the will that made Emily sink into her father's leather desk chair, that made tears start sliding down her face before she'd finished the first paragraph, because her father's voice came through so clearly in those pages, not the distant corporate voice she'd heard for years, but something older, warmer, the voice of the man who used to read her bedtime stories and call her his little architect. He wrote that he knew she'd find this eventually, that he'd hidden it in the one place she might remember from childhood, in the model that represented everything he'd built and everything he hoped to pass on to her. He wrote that the charitable will was a decoy, a necessary deception, because he discovered that Vanessa had been systematically preparing to contest his will for years, building a case for his diminished capacity, collecting statements from doctors and business associates, positioning herself to claim that any will leaving assets to Emily had been executed under undue influence or cognitive decline. Richard had learned about Vanessa's plans from a private investigator he'd hired, had seen the legal strategy taking shape, had understood that if he left everything to Emily directly, Vanessa would tie the estate up in litigation for years, would drag Emily through depositions and court appearances and public examination, would use every resource of his considerable fortune to break Emily financially and emotionally in pursuit of her own inheritance. So he'd made a different choice, a harder choice, had created a will that excluded Emily entirely, had pushed her away over the final years of his life, had made himself seem cold and distant and disappointed, all to convince Vanessa that Emily was no threat, that the daughter posed no obstacle to whatever Vanessa hoped to claim after his death. The charitable distribution was bait, Richard wrote, something Vanessa couldn't resist challenging, something that would keep her focused on fighting organizations with deep pockets and legal departments, while Emily remained safely outside the battlefield. But the real will, this document Emily now held in trembling hands, was to be filed only after Vanessa had committed to her legal challenge, only after she'd revealed her strategy and her witnesses and her entire case in probate court. Because once Vanessa had publicly argued that Richard was mentally incompetent when he signed the charitable will, she would have destroyed her own ability to challenge any previous will, would have essentially testified that her husband lacked capacity during the exact period when the real will had been executed. It was a legal trap, Richard explained, a strategy worthy of the chess player he'd always been, using his wife's greed and ambition against her, letting her build a case that would ultimately destroy her own position and guarantee that Emily received every dollar of the inheritance she deserved. Emily read the letter 3 times, her father's words blurring through tears, and she understood finally what he'd meant by, "I'm sorry for what I had to do," understood that pushing her away had been protection rather than rejection, that the cold distance of their final years had been armor he'd wrapped around her, a shield against a woman who would have destroyed Emily without hesitation if she'd seen her as competition. He wrote that he'd wanted to explain, had wanted to tell her the truth so many times, but that any contact between them would have undermined the performance, would have given Vanessa reason to suspect that Emily still mattered, that she still posed a threat to whatever Vanessa hoped to inherit. So he'd stayed silent and distant and seemingly indifferent, had let Emily believe the worst about him, had died knowing his daughter thought him cruel and uncaring, all because it was the only way he could protect her from the woman sleeping in the bedroom down the hall. The last paragraph of his letter said that he hoped Emily would forgive him, that she would understand the choices he'd made were born from love rather than indifference, and that she would use the inheritance not just to clear her debts and secure her future, but to build something meaningful, something that mattered, something that would make the world slightly better than she'd found it. He signed it, "Your father who loved you more than buildings or money or empire, even when he couldn't show it." And Emily sat in his chair with that letter pressed against her chest, crying for the man who died protecting her, crying for all the years of silence that had been sacrifice rather than abandonment, crying for the father she'd lost twice, once to grief and ambition, and then again to death, but who had loved her all along in the only way he knew how. She was still sitting there, still holding the letter and the will, when she heard footsteps on the stairs, heard Vanessa's voice calling her name with an edge of anger, and Emily understood that her stepmother must have seen her entering the house, must have realized Emily was searching through Richard's study, and she knew that the confrontation she'd been avoiding was about to arrive whether she was ready for it or not, and she carefully, deliberately placed her father's real will back in its envelope and held it against her chest as Vanessa appeared in the doorway, her expression shifting from anger to calculation to something harder when she saw what Emily was holding, when she realized that the game had just changed in ways she hadn't anticipated, in ways that were about to cost her everything. Vanessa stood in the doorway of Richard's study with morning light cutting across her face in angles that made her look older than her 52 years, and Emily watched her stepmother's eyes move from the envelope in Emily's hands to the open architectural model on the desk to the filing cabinets with their drawers pulled open, and something like understanding passed across Vanessa's carefully maintained features. Understanding followed immediately by rage, by calculation, by the particular expression of someone realizing they've been outmaneuvered by a dead man. She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her with a softness that felt more threatening than if she'd slammed it, and she asked in a voice like silk over razors what exactly Emily thought she was doing, breaking into her house, rifling through private documents, disturbing a widow's grief with this unseemly treasure hunt through her late husband's possessions. Emily stood, still holding the envelope, and she felt something shift inside her, some fundamental reordering of power dynamics that had governed their relationship for 14 years, because she wasn't the uncertain stepdaughter anymore, wasn't the girl who could be dismissed or manipulated or bought off with promises of debt relief. She told Vanessa that this was her father's house, her father's study, her father's papers, and that the key she'd used to enter had been given to her by Richard himself years ago, back when this was still her home, before Vanessa had slowly, methodically erased every trace of Emily's childhood from these rooms. Vanessa's expression tightened, her hands curling into fists at her sides, and she said that the house belonged to the estate now, that everything in it was subject to probate law, and that removing documents without authorization was theft, potentially criminal, certainly grounds for legal action that would make Emily's already complicated life considerably more difficult. But Emily had spent the last hour reading her father's letter, understanding his strategy, seeing the chess game he'd been playing right up until his death, and she realized that Vanessa's threats only worked if Emily was afraid, only had power if Emily believed she was still operating from a position of weakness. She asked Vanessa a simple question, asked her directly why she'd been so nervous yesterday, why she'd brought her personal attorney to what should have been a family conversation, why she'd seemed so desperate for Emily's cooperation in contesting the charitable will. Vanessa's face went very still, the kind of stillness that comes right before violence or revelation, and Emily pressed forward because she could see the cracks forming in her stepmother's facade, could sense that whatever Vanessa had been hiding was close to the surface now, ready to spill out if pushed just slightly harder. She told Vanessa that she knew about the investigators, knew that her stepmother had been building a case against Richard's mental capacity for years, collecting evidence and statements and medical records, and she watched Vanessa's eyes widen just fractionally, just enough to confirm that Emily had struck close to truth. Vanessa recovered quickly, her lawyer's training kicking in, and she said that any responsible spouse would be concerned about their partner's declining health, that documenting cognitive changes was prudent estate planning, not conspiracy. But her voice had lost some of its certainty, some of its commanding authority, and Emily could hear the desperation threading through her stepmother's carefully chosen words. Emily moved around the desk, still holding the envelope, and she told Vanessa that she'd found something in this room, something her father had hidden specifically for her to discover, and she watched her stepmother's face cycle through emotions too quickly to fully register, fear and anger and calculation all bleeding into one another. Vanessa asked what Emily had found, demanded to see it, reached out as if to take the envelope by force, but Emily stepped back, held the papers against her chest, and she said that what she'd found was the truth about Richard's final wishes, the real truth, not the performance he'd staged for Vanessa's benefit. Vanessa went very pale then, the expensive makeup she always wore suddenly looking like a mask painted over fear, and she said in a voice that tried for dismissive but landed somewhere closer to panic that Richard's will had already been filed, that the charitable distribution was legal and binding, that whatever Emily thought she'd found didn't change the fundamental fact that Richard had chosen to leave his fortune to charity rather than to the daughter who'd disappointed him. The cruelty of that last statement hung in the air between them, and Emily felt anger finally cutting through the grief she'd been carrying, felt fury at this woman who'd married her father for his money and his status and had spent 14 years slowly poisoning the relationship between father and daughter, creating distance where there should have been connection, manufacturing coldness where there might have been love. She told Vanessa that her father hadn't been disappointed in her at all, that the distance and silence of his final years had been protective coloring, camouflage designed to keep Emily safe from exactly the kind of legal warfare Vanessa had been planning. And she watched her stepmother's expression shift from defensive to calculating as Vanessa began working through the implications, began understanding that she'd been played by a man who'd anticipated her moves years in advance. Vanessa's voice dropped to something softer, more dangerous, and she told Emily that she should be very careful about what documents she decided to produce, that estate litigation was nasty and public and involved investigations into everyone's background, everyone's finances, everyone's secrets. She suggested that Emily's own life might not withstand that kind of scrutiny, that teachers with student loan debt and medical bills could be portrayed as desperate, as willing to fabricate documents for financial gain, and that Vanessa had resources Emily couldn't imagine, connections to judges and attorneys and private investigators who could make Emily's existence very uncomfortable if she chose to stand in the way of a grieving widow's rightful inheritance. It was threat and manipulation wrapped in concern, and Emily recognized the same tactics Vanessa had used yesterday, the same strategy of suggesting darkness without providing specifics, using fear and uncertainty as weapons against someone who didn't know better. But Emily wasn't the same person she'd been yesterday, wasn't the uncertain daughter who'd walked into Martin Whitmore's office expecting rejection and found exactly what she'd feared. She'd read her father's letter, understood his sacrifice, seen the years of distance recontextualized as love rather than abandonment, and she felt anchored by that truth in a way that made Vanessa's threats seem hollow, performative, the last desperate moves of someone who could see the game slipping away. She told Vanessa that she was taking the documents she'd found to Martin Whitmore, that she was filing them with the probate court as her father had intended, and that Vanessa could do whatever she wanted with her lawyers and her threats and her manufactured grief, but that none of it would change the fundamental truth that Richard Richardson had outsmarted her, had seen her coming from years away, and had built a legal trap that would snap shut the moment Vanessa committed herself to the charitable will contest. Vanessa moved fast for a woman in heels and designer clothing, crossed the room in 3 quick steps, and grabbed for the envelope with a desperation that confirmed everything Emily had been suspecting, confirmed that her stepmother knew exactly what was in those papers, knew that her entire strategy depended on this second will never surfacing. They struggled briefly, awkwardly, 2 women fighting over paper and ink, and the ghost of a man who'd orchestrated this confrontation from beyond death. And Emily held on because she understood that this envelope contained not just inheritance but vindication, not just money, but proof that her father had loved her enough to sacrifice their relationship to protect her future. The envelope tore slightly, pages threatening to scatter, and Emily shoved Vanessa back hard enough that her stepmother stumbled against the desk, knocked over the architectural model that had hidden the truth for 8 months, sent it crashing to the hardwood floor, where it broke into pieces, tiny windows and miniature bricks scattering across the study like the wreckage of her father's first dream. They both froze, staring at the broken model, and Emily felt something crack inside her chest because that model had been precious, had been one of the few physical connections to her childhood, to the father who'd let her play with something valuable because he valued her presence more. Vanessa saw the tears starting in Emily's eyes, and she laughed, actually laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and she said that Emily had always been weak, had always let emotion cloud her judgment, that Richard had been the same way before Vanessa had taught him to prioritize logic over sentiment, business over family, success over the meaningless connections that held people back from their full potential. She said it like confession, like revelation, and Emily understood suddenly that Vanessa hadn't just married her father for money. She'd actively worked to transform him, had deliberately severed his emotional connections, had isolated him from his daughter, not just out of greed, but out of some twisted belief that she was making him stronger, better, more capable of the ruthlessness required for empire. Emily picked up the pages that had fallen from the torn envelope. Her father's will and letter, now slightly crumpled, but still intact, still legally valid, and she told Vanessa that she pitied her, that anyone who thought love was weakness and family was obstacle had missed the entire point of being human, had traded everything meaningful for a balance sheet and a Beacon Hill address. Vanessa's expression went cold, the artificial warmth she'd been performing for 14 years, finally burning away to reveal something harder underneath, something calculating and merciless. And she said that pity from a teacher making $40,000 a year was worthless, that Emily had chosen a life of struggle and virtue, signaling while Vanessa had chosen power and security, and that history would prove which choice was wiser. Emily walked toward the door, done with this conversation, done with this woman who'd poisoned her father's final years. But Vanessa wasn't finished, called after her with one last threat wrapped in silk. She said that if Emily filed that will, if she went to Martin Whitmore and initiated a legal challenge to the charitable distribution, Vanessa would make sure certain information came to light about Richard's business practices, about deals he'd made in the early years, about corner cutting and bribery, and the kinds of ethical compromises that built fortunes but destroyed legacies. She said it would be a shame if Emily's father's reputation was torn apart in probate court, if his empire was revealed to be built on fraud and corruption, if his name became synonymous with scandal rather than success. And she suggested that maybe Emily should think about whether her inheritance was worth destroying her father's memory, whether money mattered more than preserving whatever dignity Richard's death might have carried. Emily stopped in the doorway, her back to Vanessa, and she thought about her father's letter, about his admission that he'd made hard choices, that he'd built his success through determination that sometimes crossed into ruthlessness, but that in the end, he'd tried to use that success for something good, had tried to protect the one person who mattered more than buildings or profits. She turned back to face her stepmother, and she said that her father's legacy wasn't his fortune or his buildings or whatever ethical compromises he'd made along the way. It was his final act of love, his willingness to sacrifice his own reputation and his relationship with his daughter to keep her safe from predators like Vanessa. She said that if Vanessa wanted to drag Richard's name through court, if she wanted to expose whatever darkness lived in the foundation of his empire, then Emily would let her, because the truth of her father's love was worth more than any reputation, any public image, any carefully maintained fiction of respectability. Vanessa's face went through several expressions, settling finally on something like hatred, pure and undisguised, and Emily realized that her stepmother had expected her to back down, had counted on Emily's love for her father being leverageable, being something Vanessa could use to maintain control. But Vanessa had miscalculated, had failed to understand that Emily's love for Richard was precisely what made her willing to let his reputation burn, if that's what it took to honor his final wishes, to complete the strategy he'd set in motion with his own death. Emily left the study, left Vanessa standing among the pieces of that broken architectural model, and she walked down the curved staircase and out through the foyer where she'd entered as a child and left now as something else, someone harder and clearer and more certain of exactly what needed to be done. She took the tea to Martin Whitmore's office, the envelope pressed against her side inside her jacket, and she thought about chess games and long strategies and fathers who loved their daughters enough to become villains in their own story, if that's what protection required. Martin was in his office despite the early hour, waiting for her as if he'd known she'd come back with something, and when Emily placed the torn envelope on his desk, when she showed him her father's real will and the letter that explained everything, Martin read it twice with an expression that shifted from professional assessment to something almost like admiration, and he said that Richard Richardson had been many things in life, but in death he'd managed to be something more important. He'd managed to be a father who understood that love sometimes looks like distance, that protection sometimes requires performance, and that the greatest gift you could give your child wasn't money or status, but the freedom to live without fear of those who would do them harm. Martin explained what would happen next, the legal process of filing the new will, the revelations that would emerge during probate court, the trap that would spring shut around Vanessa the moment she testified that Richard lacked mental capacity during the period when both wills had been executed. He said it would be messy and public and potentially ugly, that Vanessa would fight with everything she had, that there would be depositions and investigations and probably media attention given the size of the estate and the nature of the competing wills. But he also said that the law was on Emily's side, that her father had structured everything perfectly, had anticipated every counter-move and every legal challenge, and that unless Emily wanted to walk away, wanted to let the charitable distribution stand and disappear back into her quiet teaching life, the inheritance was hers, the victory was certain, the justice her father had engineered was waiting to be claimed. Emily looked at Martin Whitmore, this man who'd known her father for 40 years, who'd watched Richard Richardson transform from ambitious developer into distant tycoon, into dying chess player moving pieces on a board only he could see. And she asked if Martin thought her father would want her to go through with it, if Richard would want his name dragged through probate court and his business practices examined and his legacy potentially tarnished. And Martin smiled, a sad knowing expression, and he said that Richard had known exactly what filing this second will would trigger, had understood the risks and the revelations and the potential costs, and he'd done it anyway because he'd decided that Emily's future mattered more than his past, that her security was worth his reputation, and that some truths were important enough to surface no matter what damage they caused along the way. And if this story is stirring something inside you, keep walking with me, because there are deeper truths still waiting to surface, and I don't want you to miss what comes next. The probate hearing was scheduled for a cold morning in late November, 3 weeks after Emily had filed her father's second will with the court, 3 weeks during which Vanessa's attorneys had filed emergency motions and demanded forensic document analysis and generally done everything possible to delay the inevitable confrontation that Richard Richardson had engineered from his grave. Emily sat in the gallery of Suffolk County Probate Court, watching lawyers in expensive suits shuffle papers and confer in whispers, and she thought about her father sitting in his study 8 months ago, dying slowly from the cancer that had been eating through his liver, writing that letter and hiding that will, and staging his own final performance with the cold precision of a man who understood that love sometimes required cruelty, that protection sometimes demanded distance, that saving your child might mean letting them believe you'd abandoned them. Martin Whitmore sat at the petitioner's table with 2 associates flanking him, and across the aisle, Douglas Pembroke represented Vanessa, who looked perfectly composed in black Chanel and pearls, every inch the grieving widow, defending her late husband's true intentions from an opportunistic daughter who'd appeared only after death made reconciliation impossible. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Margaret Holloway, 20 years on the probate bench, and she had the particular expression of someone who'd seen every variation of family greed and dysfunction that that death and money could produce, who approached estate disputes with the weary cynicism of someone who knew that inheritance brought out the absolute worst in otherwise decent people. Judge Holloway called the hearing to order and asked Martin to present his case, and Emily's attorney stood with the measured confidence of someone who'd been practicing estate law since before Emily was born, someone who knew exactly how strong their position was and exactly how devastating the revelation would be. He explained to the court that 3 weeks prior, Emily Richardson had discovered a second will executed by Richard Richardson, dated 14 days after the charitable will currently filed with the estate, and that this second will revoked all previous testamentary documents and left the entirety of the estate to Richard's daughter. He submitted the document for the court's review, along with the letter Richard had written, explaining his strategy, explaining why he'd created 2 wills, explaining the trap he'd set for a wife who'd been planning to destroy his daughter through years of probate litigation. Douglas Pembroke objected immediately, argued that the second will was convenient fiction, that no legitimate testator would hide a will in a child's toy, that the entire scenario suggested fraud or forgery or desperate fabrication by a daughter who'd been righteously excluded from her father's estate. He argued that the handwriting should be analyzed by experts, that the witnesses listed on the document should be deposed, that everything about this supposed second will warranted skepticism and thorough investigation before the court gave it any credence whatsoever. Judge Holloway listened with an expression that revealed nothing, and she asked Martin if the witnesses to the second will were available for testimony, and Martin said they were, that both witnesses were present in the courtroom and prepared to testify under oath about the circumstances of the will's execution. The first witness was called, a woman named Patricia Chen, 74 years old, who'd worked as Richard Richardson's executive assistant for 32 years, who'd been with him through his first wife's death and his second marriage, and the slow dissolution of his relationship with his daughter. She testified that Richard had asked her to witness a private document 8 months ago, that he'd explained it was a personal matter of great importance, that he'd been entirely lucid and coherent and specific about his intentions. She said that Richard had made her promise not to mention the document to anyone, especially not to Vanessa, and that she'd kept that promise until Martin Whitmore had contacted her 2 weeks ago, asking her to testify about what she'd witnessed. Douglas Pembroke cross-examined her aggressively, suggested she was lying to protect Emily, implied she'd been promised money or favors in exchange for false testimony, but Patricia remained steady, unshakable, and she said with quiet dignity that she'd loved Richard Richardson like family, that she'd watched him suffer through impossible choices, and that she was testifying now because he'd asked her to, because she'd promised him 8 months ago that if this moment came, if his second will ever surfaced, she would tell the truth about what she'd witnessed, regardless of who tried to stop her. The second witness was called, and Emily felt her breath catch when she saw who entered the courtroom, because it was Dr. Samuel Morrison, the oncologist who'd treated her father during his final months, a man she'd never met, but whose name had appeared on medical records and death certificates. He testified that Richard Richardson had been completely mentally competent up until his final week of life, that despite the cancer and the pain medication, Richard's cognitive function had remained sharp, his decision-making capacity intact, his ability to understand complex information unimpaired. He said that Richard had specifically asked him to document his mental status during their appointments, had wanted detailed medical records establishing his competency, and that Dr. Morrison had wondered at the time why his patient was so concerned about proving his sound mind when there was no obvious need for such documentation. Douglas Pembroke stood to cross-examine, and this was the moment Emily had been waiting for, the moment when Vanessa's entire strategy would turn against her, because Pembroke began questioning Dr. Morrison about Richard's decline, about moments of confusion or disorientation, about the effects of medication on judgment and reasoning. Dr. Morrison answered each question carefully, honestly, describing the minimal cognitive impacts Richard had experienced. And Pembroke pressed harder, asked about specific incidents from medical records, records, times when Richard had seemed less than fully aware, and the doctor acknowledged that yes, there had been a few episodes in the final month, brief periods of confusion that were entirely normal for someone in Richard's condition. And that's when Martin Whitmore stood to redirect. That's when the trap snapped shut with the precision Richard had designed 8 months earlier. Martin asked Dr. Morrison to clarify the timeline of these episodes, to specify exactly when Richard's cognitive function had begun to decline, and the doctor consulted his records and stated that the confusion and disorientation had started approximately 6 weeks before Richard's death, that prior to that point his patient had been remarkably clear-minded given his condition. Martin then produced the dates of both wills, showed that the charitable will had been executed 8 months prior, well within the period Dr. Morrison had just described as characterized by full mental competency, and showed that the second will, the one leaving everything to Emily, had been executed 7.5 months prior, even earlier in the timeline of Richard's illness, even further from any possible cognitive decline. The courtroom went very quiet as the implications settled over everyone present, as they understood what Richard Richardson had done, how he'd structured his final strategy. Martin explained it carefully for the record, laid out the trap with the methodical precision of a man who'd spent 3 weeks preparing for exactly this moment. He noted that Vanessa Richardson, through her attorney Douglas Pembroke, had filed a contest of the charitable will based on diminished mental capacity, had argued that Richard lacked the cognitive function to execute valid testamentary documents during his final months. But the medical evidence just presented established that Richard's competency had been intact until 6 weeks before his death, which meant that both wills had been executed during a period of full mental capacity, which meant that if Vanessa succeeded in invalidating the charitable will, she would simultaneously validate the earlier will, leaving everything to Emily, because both documents had been created by the same lucid mind during the same window of competency. Vanessa's face went pale, the carefully maintained composure finally cracking, and Emily watched her stepmother lean over to whisper urgently to Douglas Pembroke, watched the lawyer's expression shift from confident to confused to something like horror as he worked through the implications, as he understood that his own legal strategy had been weaponized against his client, that every argument he'd made to contest the charitable will had actually strengthened Emily's position, had actually proven that Richard Richardson had been perfectly capable of executing the second will that left everything to his daughter. Judge Holloway asked if counsel for Vanessa Richardson wished to present any evidence or testimony, and Douglas Pembroke stood slowly, looking like a man who'd just realized he'd been playing checkers while his opponent had been playing chess, and he requested a recess to confer with his client. The judge granted 30 minutes, and Emily walked out into the courthouse hallway where winter light came through tall windows in shafts that caught dust and made the marble floors glow like something from a cathedral. And she thought about her father planning this moment, writing that letter, hiding that will, executing a strategy so perfect that Vanessa had no possible countermove, no way to escape the trap without destroying her own case. Martin found her standing by the window, and he told her that it was over, that Vanessa would withdraw her contest, that no competent attorney would let their client proceed with a case that had been so thoroughly undermined, and he said that within a few weeks, the probate process would be complete. The estate would be distributed according to Richard's true final wishes, and Emily would inherit everything her father had built. But Emily wasn't thinking about the money, wasn't focused on the inheritance or the victory or the justice her father had engineered. She was thinking about the cost, about the years of distance and silence, about all the time she'd believed her father had stopped loving her, when in fact he'd loved her so much that he'd been willing to become the villain in her story, willing to let her hate him if that's what protection required. She was thinking about the letter still folded in her jacket pocket, the one she'd read so many times she'd memorized every word, every phrase, every indication that beneath the coldness had been a father terrified of losing his daughter to a woman who would have destroyed her without hesitation. When they returned to the courtroom, Douglas Pembroke stood and informed Judge Holloway that after conferring with his client, they were withdrawing their contest of the charitable will and acknowledging the validity of the second testamentary document presented by Emily Richardson. Vanessa sat rigid beside her attorney, her face a mask of controlled fury, and when the judge asked if she understood that withdrawing the contest meant accepting the second will's distribution, Vanessa said yes, in a voice like ice, said she understood perfectly, said she recognized when she'd been outmaneuvered by someone smarter than herself. It was the closest thing to admission Emily would ever get, the nearest Vanessa would come to acknowledging that Richard Richardson had beaten her, that even in death he'd proven himself more strategic, more capable, more loving than the woman who tried to erase his daughter from his legacy. Judge Holloway ruled from the bench, declared the second will valid and controlling, ordered the estate distributed according to its terms, and dismissed the proceedings with the brisk efficiency of someone ready to move on to the next family, tearing itself apart over inheritance. Emily stood as the courtroom emptied, stood watching Vanessa gather her designer purse and her expensive coat, and their eyes met across the aisle one final time. And Emily saw in her stepmother's expression not just defeat, but something like respect, grudging and bitter but real, recognition that Emily had proven herself worthy of Richard Richardson's final gambit, worthy of the love that had disguised itself as abandonment. Outside the courthouse, November wind cut through the streets of downtown Boston, and Emily pulled out her phone and looked at the last photo she had of her father, taken 3 years ago at a company event, his face already showing the strain of illness he hadn't yet disclosed, his eyes looking past the camera towards something only he could see. She whispered thank you to that image, to the ghost of the man who'd sacrificed everything to protect her, and she promised him that she would use his gift wisely, would build something meaningful with the inheritance he'd fought so hard to preserve, would honor his memory not with buildings or monuments, but with the kind of life he'd wanted for her all along, a life free from fear, secure from predators, rich with possibility and purpose, and the particular freedom that comes from knowing you were loved enough that someone would burn their own reputation to keep you safe. Spring came to Boston, the way it always did, uncertain and hesitant, winter holding on through April, before finally releasing its grip to let cherry blossoms open along the Charles River and tulips push through soil in the public garden. Emily stood in the empty study of the Beacon Hill house, boxes stacked around her, containing her father's books and files and the accumulated artifacts of a life spent building things that would outlast him. And she thought about transformation, about how places could hold memory like walls held heat, releasing it slowly, long after the source had gone cold. She'd listed the house for sale 2 weeks ago, couldn't bear to live in these rooms where Vanessa had reigned for 14 years, where her father had died alone except for a wife who'd been counting his assets while he drew his last breaths. But standing here now in the late afternoon light, she felt something like peace settling over the grief, something like understanding replacing the anger that had sustained her through the probate battle. The architectural model sat on the desk, carefully repaired, each tiny brick glued back into place, each miniature window restored to its position, and Emily had spent 3 evenings reconstructing it because it felt important, felt like completing something her father had started, like honoring the man who'd let her play with valuable things because he valued her presence more than their monetary worth. She picked it up now, turned it in her hands, and she could almost see herself as a child, small fingers rearranging the tiny cars in the parking lot, creating stories about the families who lived in those miniature apartments, while her father worked at this desk and occasionally looked up to smile at her, to remind her that she belonged here, that this room and this house and this life had space for her dreaming. The money had come through 3 weeks ago, $73.2 million, transferred into accounts Martin Whitmore had established, and Emily had sat in her small Somerville apartment, staring at bank statements that looked like fiction, like numbers too large to be real, certainly too large to be hers. She'd paid off her student loans first, watched $60,000 disappear in a single transaction, then cleared her medical debts, and she'd felt something loosen in her chest. Some chronic tension she'd carried for so long, she'd forgotten it wasn't permanent, wasn't natural, wasn't just the cost of being alive in modern America. But the real freedom came not from the absence of debt, but from the presence of possibility, from understanding that her father's final gift wasn't just financial security, but permission to build a life that mattered, to pursue meaning without the constant calculation of cost versus survival. She'd started the foundation in March, filed papers establishing the Richard and Claire Richardson Educational Trust, named for her father and the mother who died too young, and she'd endowed it with $20 million, enough to provide full scholarships to 100 students annually, kids from circumstances like hers who wanted to teach or serve or pursue careers that paid in purpose rather than profit. Martin Whitmore had helped structure it, had ensured the endowment would last in perpetuity, would keep funding students long after Emily herself was gone, and she thought her father would have appreciated that, would have liked knowing his fortune was transforming into something that couldn't be measured in buildings or balance sheets, but in lives changed, opportunities created, futures unlocked for kids who might otherwise have drowned in debt for choosing passion over pragmatism. She'd kept enough for herself, more than enough really, had purchased a small house in Cambridge near the elementary school where she still taught, because she'd discovered that she loved teaching, loved the particular challenge of shaping young minds, loved the daily evidence that her work mattered in ways that quarterly earnings reports could never capture. Some of her friends from graduate school had been shocked that she'd stayed in the classroom after inheriting a fortune, had assumed she'd quit immediately, travel the world, or start some vanity business, or do whatever it was that newly wealthy people did with their unexpected windfalls. But Emily had realized something during those weeks of probate hearings and legal revelations, had understood that her father's greatest gift wasn't the money itself, but the validation that her choices had been right, that teaching was valuable, that purpose mattered more than profit, that she'd been correct all along to prioritize meaning over the kind of success that showed up in Forbes magazine profiles. The Beacon Hill house would sell for somewhere north of $8 million, Martin predicted, and Emily planned to donate that money as well, split it between organizations focused on cancer research and housing security, causes that would have meant something to her father, that addressed the diseases and inequities he'd encountered during his 7 decades moving through the world. Vanessa had moved to New York within 2 weeks of the probate ruling, had disappeared into whatever life wealthy divorcees built for themselves in Manhattan penthouses, and Emily had heard nothing from her stepmother since that final moment in the courthouse, that last acknowledgement that she'd been beaten by a better strategist, outplayed by a man who'd loved his daughter more than Vanessa had loved money. Emily walked through the house one final time, room by room, remembering her childhood here before her mother's death, before Vanessa, before everything had calcified into distance and formality. She stood in what had been her bedroom, unchanged since she'd moved out for college, and she thought about the girl she'd been, uncertain and eager to please, desperate for her father's approval, believing that his coldness meant she'd failed some fundamental test of worthiness. If she could speak to that younger version of herself, she'd tell her that love sometimes looked like absence, that protection sometimes required performance, that the people who hurt us aren't always the villains we imagine, but sometimes just humans making impossible choices with incomplete information and more fear than wisdom. The sun was setting over Beacon Hill when Emily finally locked the door for the last time, the old brass key heavy in her hand, and she stood on those worn stone steps, watching light fade from brick townhouses that had witnessed generations of families, centuries of love and loss, and the small human dramas that accumulated into history. She thought about her father's letter, the the one she still carried folded in her wallet, creased from repeated reading, the ink slightly faded, but the words still clear, still offering comfort when grief threatened to overwhelm the gratitude. He'd written that he hoped she'd forgive him, but she'd moved beyond forgiveness into something deeper, something more like understanding, recognizing that imperfect love was still love, that flawed protection was still protection, that her father had done the best he could with the limited tools grief and fear and terminal illness had left him. She walked down the hill toward Charles Street, past the boutiques and restaurants where tourists and locals mingled in the warm spring evening, and she thought about legacy, about how we're remembered, about whether buildings and fortunes mattered as much as the lives we touched and the people we saved and the quiet sacrifices we made that no one would ever know about except the ones we loved. Her father's empire would eventually be forgotten. His developments would be demolished or renovated beyond recognition, but the foundation bearing his name would keep transforming lives for generations, would keep offering opportunities to kids who needed them. And that felt like the kind of immortality that actually mattered, the kind that made the world incrementally better rather than just more built up, more profitable, more impressive from a distance. Emily reached the river, found a bench overlooking the water where sailboats drifted in evening light and joggers passed in steady rhythm, and she pulled out her phone to look at that last photo of her father one more time. She'd spent months being angry at him, years feeling abandoned by him, but she understood now that he'd never left her at all, had been protecting her every moment of that terrible silence, had been playing a game against an opponent who would have destroyed Emily without hesitation if she'd seen her as competition. Love, she'd learned, wasn't always warm embraces and encouraging words. Sometimes it was cold distance and strategic silence. Sometimes it was letting someone hate you so they could survive the people who wanted to hurt them. Sometimes it was dying alone so your daughter could live free. She whispered goodbye to the photo, to the ghost, to the father who'd loved her in the only way his circumstances had allowed, and she made a promise to the fading light and the moving water and the city that had shaped them both, that she would honor his sacrifice not with monuments or memorials, but with a life well lived, purposeful and generous, and focused on building the kind of future he'd wanted for her all along. A future where kindness mattered more than conquest, where love was measured in sacrifice rather than sentiment, where the greatest legacy you could leave wasn't what you built but who you saved, and how you loved them even when showing it was impossible, even when protection required becoming the villain in your own daughter's story so she could be the hero in her own life. Before you go, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story, because each week a new hidden truth rises to the surface, and I want you with me for every twist.